Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to be using the midpoint formula. Now, this is um, an extension of the lesson that you focused on previously. But in this lesson, you're going to be given one endpoint and you're going to be given the midpoint. And then you're going to be asked to find the other endpoint. Now, that's a little bit different from what you did previously. What you did previously was this. Given two endpoints, you found the midpoint. That's what you did previously. So let's kind of review that part. So here's a review question. And so find the midpoint of a segment whose endpoints are negative 3, 4, and 9, 8. Now remember the midpoint formula is this. So your midpoint formula, so to find the midpoint, you're basically going to add your x coordinates together and then divide by 2. And then you're going to add your y coordinates together and then divide by 2. That was the midpoint formula. That was the midpoint formula you used in the previous lesson. And what you did was you labeled these midpoints. And you didn't have to, but many students find it very useful. So they'll call this the first point and this the second point. It does not matter. You could have called this the second point, this the first point. It does not matter. You'll still get the same answer for the midpoint. So if you went ahead and you said this was going to be my first point and this was going to be my second point, what I mean by that is this. This is your x coordinate of the first point, so notice x sub 1. And this is the y coordinate of the first point, so y sub 1. This is the second point, so this is going to be the x coordinate of the second point, x sub 2. And this is the y coordinate of the second point, so it's going to be y sub 2. Now I'm using the word x sub 1. So that's how you remember these are subscripts. So we read it as x sub 1, y sub 1, x sub 2, y sub 2. Okay? All right, and so you just plugged it in. You just plugged in chug. So the midpoint the midpoint of this segment then would be negative 3 plus 9, negative 3 plus 9 divided by 2, comma, and then you add your y's together and take the average. Because remember, midpoint is, you got to think of average. So you would say 4 plus 8 divided by 2. And so that's going to equal negative 3 plus 9 is 6. And then 4 plus 8 is 12. And so you get 3 comma 6. So that will be the midpoint. So this is your midpoint. Okay? All right, so if you look at it in terms of a graph, this is what you saw. So I went ahead and I plotted those 2 points we're looking at. Now let me go ahead and draw the segment joining those 2 points. And so when I do that, I'm going to get this. All right, so there's the segment. Remember, you're dealing with a segment, not a line. Okay, a line doesn't have, remember, a line extends indefinitely. So it doesn't, you can't talk about a midpoint of a line. You can only talk about a midpoint of a segment. So remember, this was the point negative 3, 5. Oops, I'm sorry. That was negative 3, 4, wasn't it? Okay, so let me go ahead and redraw this then. So negative 3, 4. And then it was what, 9, 8? 9, 8. So 9, 8 is what, here? Okay. So let me go ahead and redraw this. So here's the segment. So this is negative 3, 4, and this is 9, 8. And so what we found when we used the midpoint formula, what we found was this. We found that this point here is the midpoint. So that's the point in the middle of that segment. So that was 3 comma 6. So it was 3, 6 right here. That's the midpoint. So this right here was your midpoint. So your midpoint was denoted as was denoted as 3 comma 6. Okay. All right. Now what we're doing now is this. So what we want to do in this lesson here, in this one here, is given one of these and given the midpoint, how would you find the other endpoint? So given one of the endpoints and the midpoint, you need to find the other end point. Okay, and all you do is you're just going to use this formula. You're going to use this formula. Okay, all right. Now listen carefully about what to say though. So let's look at some examples. All right, so the question is going to be this. The direction is going to say, find the endpoint of a segment whose midpoint and other endpoint is given. Okay, so you're going to be given the midpoint, and you're going to be given one of the endpoints, and you want to find this other endpoint. Okay, all right. So let's look at this example. Number one. All right. Suppose we had one of the endpoints this. So you're given this endpoint -2, 7, and you are given the midpoint 8, 2. All right, 8, 2. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me write out the word midpoint. And midpoint is 8, 2. All right, now, what you're going to do is this. This is the way I would approach this. First of all, remember your midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula is this. Midpoint equals x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, and then you add your y's together and divide by 2. All right, so it helps you do need to use this midpoint formula to do this problem. Okay, so now here's the way I'm going to do this. So let's call the midpoint here xy. So the midpoint has coordinates xy. All right, and so here's what I would do. Okay, so remember a while ago where we said when we did this problem, we called this the first point, this the second point, and I denoted these as x sub 1, y sub 1, x sub 2, y sub 2. Do the same thing here. Let this endpoint be one of your points, either the first or second. Does not matter. It does not matter. So what I'm saying is this. Let's say this is x1 and this is y1. Okay? Let's say that's your first point. So what you're going to do is you're going to find your second endpoint. And let's call the midpoint here, let's call the midpoint xy. So x is going to be 8, y is going to be 2. So that's going to denote this right here. Okay? All right, now listen carefully. Listen carefully. So I'm trying to find the other endpoint, right? I'm trying to find the other endpoint. So what I would do then is I would denote that using x2, y2. That's the way I would do that. So I'm given x1, y1, right? I'm given the midpoint xy, and I got to find x2, y2, the second endpoint. All right, so here's what you would then do. So you know that the x coordinate of the midpoint, see this is your midpoint, right? So you know the x coordinate of the midpoint is 8, correct? So this right here is 8. So you're going to say x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, x1 plus y2 divided by 2 is equal to 8, 2. Y'all agree? Y'all agree that this is the midpoint form and that's the midpoint? So listen, you have two coordinates that are equal to each other, right? You have this coordinate equal, this point equal to this point. So that means that the x coordinates have to equal and the y coordinates have to equal. Okay? So what you're going to do is this. You're going to say, all right, well, I know that x1 plus x2 divided by 2 has to equal 8. And I know that, I'm sorry, that should be x1 plus y, y plus x2, right? Okay. So I know that x1 plus x2 divided by 2 has to equal 8. And I know that y1 plus y2 divided by 2 has to equal 2, right? So your x coordinates, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, this is your midpoint, that has to equal 8, and then the average of your y coordinates has to equal 2, all right? And so you just plug in. So x1's -2, x1's -2, so you're going to say -2 plus x2 divided by 2 is equal to 8. And then all you do is use something you learned at the beginning of the course. So you're going to clear your fractions, so you're going to multiply both sides by 2. And so these divide out, and to get -2 plus x2 is equal to 16. And then to solve for x2, you add 2 to both sides. And so you get x2 to equal 18. So that is the the other endpoint, that is the x-coordinate. That is the x-coordinate of the other endpoint. So the other endpoint's 18. Okay, now let's find the y-coordinate. So do the same thing. So my y1 is 7, right? So we're gonna get 7 plus y2 divided by 2 is equal to 2. So to clear the fractions, you're gonna multiply both sides by the LCD, which is 2. So times 2 times 2, these 2's divide out. So you get 7 plus y2 is equal to 4. Subtract 7. This is 0. So you get y2 is equal to a negative 3. And so your endpoint, your other endpoint then is 18 comma negative 3. 18 comma negative 3. Okay? All right, so let's look at another problem. Now, real quick, I just want to show you something. You see, I don't have enough numbers here to actually graph this, but basically what you're saying is this, and let's just visually see what we have. Okay, so I had one endpoint being negative 2, 7, right? So negative 2, 7, let's say is right. Negative 2, 7, let's say is right here. And then I had and so I'm saying the other midpoint, I'm sorry, the other endpoint is 18, negative 3. So 18, negative 3, let's say is right here. And it's not scaled right. So I'm going to draw the line. And so now what I'm saying, if I were to actually have scaled this correctly, this midpoint, 8, 2, should be in the middle. So this should be 8, 2 right here. Okay? All right. So again, I didn't draw this very well, but that is the midpoint here. So given that this is negative 2, 7, and that is now 18, negative 3, that should give me a midpoint, 8, 2. That should be 8, 2. And you can check, look, 18 plus negative 2, always check, 18 plus negative 2 divided by 2, and then 7 plus negative 3 divided by 2. So that's 18 plus negative 2 is 16, right? And what's 16 divided by 2? Well, that's 8, which is what this is. And then over here, 7 plus negative 3 is a positive 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And so that's what you wanted. Okay? So you can always check your answers. When you find that other endpoint, use the distance formula and make sure you get this back. Make sure that is your actual midpoint. Okay, let's look at another one. So it's not that bad. It looks complicated, but it really is not. So let's look at another example. Okay, so let's look at this problem. So one of our endpoints is 2, negative 3, and the midpoint of that segment is negative 4, negative 3. And I want to find the other endpoint. Okay, so find the other endpoint. So let's call that other endpoint, so this is going to be our work. So let's call that other endpoint x2, y2. Okay, and so I'm going to call this first endpoint x1, y1. That's the way I would do that. And so I know my formula. My formula says this. My formula says that the midpoint, which in this case is negative 4, negative 3, right, is equal to x1. Remember, you add your x's together. So x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, and then you add your y's together. y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And so remember, negative 4, negative 4 is the x-coordinate of your midpoint. And how to get the x-coordinate of the midpoint? You add your x's together, divide by 2. So in other words, x1 plus x2 divided by 2 must equal negative 4. Do the same thing with your y-coordinates. So that means that this is a comma here. So that means that y1 plus y2 divided by 2 must equal negative 3. And then all you do is just plug and chug. So I'm trying to find x2, y2. I know x1, y1. So let's substitute. x1 is 2. So I get 2 plus x2, which is what I'm trying to find, divided by 2 must equal negative 4. All right, now remember, let's go ahead and clear the fraction. So the LCD is 2. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. And so these 2's divide out. So I get 2 plus x2 equals a negative 8. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Subtract 2 from both sides. I get x2 equal a negative 10. So far I found that the other endpoint, so the other endpoint is going to have x coordinate of negative 10. Now let's find the y coordinate. Do the same thing. So let me go ahead and rewrite this over. So y1, remember, is up here. Y1, remember, is negative 3. So I'm going to substitute that in place of y1. So I get negative 3 plus y2 equal negative 3. I'm sorry, divided by 2 equals negative 3. All right, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to clear those fractions. And so I get negative 3 plus y2 is equal to negative 6. Okay, negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. Adding 3 to both sides, this is 0. I get y2 equals negative 6 plus 3 is a negative 3. So that is the other endpoint. So the other endpoint is negative 10, negative 3, and that will be the answer. Okay, that will be the answer. All right, so let's check it. Let's check to make sure that's correct. All right, so here's how I want to check it. I know my endpoints now, right? So you know your endpoints. So let's check. So the endpoints we know, so we're checking. Endpoints we know is 2, negative 3, and the other one is negative 10, negative 10, negative 3. So let's find the midpoint. So that's how you would check it. Find the midpoint. So to find the midpoint, remember, you add your x's together, divide by 2. Negative 2 plus negative 10 divided by 2. And then your y coordinates, negative 3 plus negative 3 divided by 2 equals negative 2 and a negative 10 is a negative 12 divided by 2. Negative 3 and a negative 3 is a negative 6 divided by 2. And notice what happens. Negative 12 divided by 2 is a negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is a negative 3. I'm sorry. Let me go back and redo this. Okay, so remember, this is 2, right? So that should be 2 plus negative 10. Excuse me, I messed up there, which is a negative 8. And negative 8 divided by 2 is a negative 4. Okay, so there's your midpoint. And so that's what you wanted, right? You wanted your midpoint, where is it? Right here. You wanted the midpoint to be negative 4, negative 3, and that's what it is. Okay, so that's how you do this. Now let's do one where we're going to have a fraction, just to kind of show you what to do. Okay, so this time we have the endpoint being negative 6, 2. Now notice the midpoint this time. The midpoint has a fraction in it. We can still deal with it. We know how to deal with that. All right, so then you want to find the other endpoint. So in other words, I want to find x2, y2. That's what I'll find, x2, y2. So let's go ahead and call this my first endpoint, x1, y1, and then let's call this xy for my midpoint. And so I know this. I know that my midpoint, which is in this case negative 5 halves, negative 4, but I know my midpoint formula is this. You're going to say x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, and then y1 plus y2 divided by 2, and that's going to equal the midpoint, which is this. So let's go ahead and use this right here. Negative 5 halves, comma, negative 4. Okay? All right, so now all you're going to do is remember that this midpoint, the x coordinate of the midpoint, you get by taking the average of the x coordinates. So in other words, x1 plus x2 divided by 2 must equal negative 5 halves. And then the same thing for the y coordinates. y1 plus y2 divided by 2 must equal negative 4. Okay? So those must be the same. And so you just substitute what you know. You're trying to find x2, that you're trying to find. And then we know that x1 is negative 6, so we're going to substitute negative 6 into x1. So I get this, negative 6 plus x2 divided by 2 is equal to negative 5 halves. Okay? Now let's go ahead and clear the fractions. So notice the LCD is 2, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 2, just like this. These 2's divide out, these 2's divide out, and notice I get negative 6 plus x2 is equal to negative 5. And all we got to do is solve for x2, so adding 6 to both sides, this is 0. I get x2 to be a positive 1. So the other endpoint will have x coordinate of 1. Now let's find the y coordinate. So now I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. These 2's divide out, so you get, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to put the y1 in there. Excuse me. Let me go ahead and, oops. So let me go ahead and do that here. So y1 is 2. So you get 2 plus y2 divided by 2 equals negative 4. So now let's go ahead and multiply both sides by 2. Just like this, these 2's divide out, so you get 2 plus y2 is equal to negative 8. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. And then you get y2 by itself. We're going to subtract 2 from both sides. This is 0, and so I get y2 is equal to negative 8, and a negative 2 is a negative 10. All right? And you can always check, guys, always check. See, you want to use the midpoint formula to check and see that's correct. See if this is correct. Now, that's your answer because that's what you want to find, the other endpoint, but let's check. It's very easy to check, and you can check this mentally. You can easily do it mentally. So remember, your endpoints that you're saying are now these: negative 6, 2, and 1, negative 10. So those are your endpoints, right? All right, so that's what you just found here, and you were given this one. So let's check and see if that's true. Let's add the x's together. So let's see what the midpoint is. So we're going to add the x's together, divide by 2, and then we're going to add the y's together and divide by 2. And let's see what happens. Well, negative 6 plus 1 is a negative 5, so you get negative 5 halves. 2 plus a negative 10 is a negative 8, and a negative 8 divided by 2 is a negative 4. And was that the midpoint that we started out with? Was that the midpoint we started out with? Right here? Yes, it was. Okay? All right, so that's all you do. That's all you do. So there are a couple of examples like this in your worksheet and also in my math lab. And it looks complicated, but it is not. All you're doing is just using the midpoint formula, but in a different way. So that's going to take care of the lesson dealing with given one endpoint and given the midpoint, find the other endpoint. Okay?